I think that that obviously Kittler has different intentions through media and communications and different things. And thank you, Patrick, for Claude Shannon. I got through the first chapter, but I don't dare do the mathematics. Yeah, but I got the idea. Right, right.
That's what I
Maybe an
said.
attempt to. Yeah, 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 exactly, exactly. But anyway, so anyway, maybe we could just start with you guys today, and then I have a few things in mind. But to me, again, the more I think about it, this whole question of representational thinking and the encounters that Heidegger really has with the Gestell is very crucial for our period. I'm noticing more and more of a increasing bureaucratization. I just got back from the store too. I had to go get some groceries to do some provisions, and I noticed prices are up 20% across the board. The price gouging is unbelievable. So inflation is really price inflation, right? We have had asset inflation for a long time, but now price inflation is really kicking in a different way. So I'm trying to think this through. What is being set up in terms of a new mentality in capital, and how do we go against this, and how do we get out of this again, this representational thinking that we're also we're consistently barraged with and subjected to. So that's certainly one question I have. And this formation, I think we're all interested here. Patrick raised it earlier. What is to be done? Who are the new agents in history? I'm teaching a class on biopolitics. I opened up the lecture today with, one question we're going to pose throughout is, where is the new agency, against this, in this pandemic? And is it all offered a space for new agency to and what does that really mean in terms of today agency? So I think these are some questions we can take forward and look at. I mean, does agency mean we're academics and these radical little outside vessels, that are not really involved that much in the world being, as much as the Heideggers and would want on one hand, and the Jungers, and the others, of course, the Gramscians, which I think is, again, a real noble thing, is to become an organic intellectual and to keep struggling on that basis. And then, where are, I'm noticing among younger students, they're very hungry for ideas. They want change. They understand what's coming down, at least some of the students that I'm speaking to. But at the same time, they have nowhere to go. We're lacking organization. We're lacking, direction. So these are, I mean, some of the questions that I have. This is obviously, to me, from Heidegger forward, we have a conservative Heideggerian in Kittler who's really interested in objects in the world. He's going to take up the things in themselves through the things themselves, right? And very interesting, where Stiegler still broaches that line, with the prosthetic and the more traditional philosophical approaches. And of course, Benjamin has, it's a programmatic essay, the art of work, the artwork in the age of technical reproduction. It was meant as a manifesto. So there's no question in my mind that this is something that is very, very clear to me. And also, how can thought not be co-opted? I mean, I have a hard time struggling still. I've read him for 30 years, at least 35 years. Adorno, I still, have a hard time struggling through him. He thinks in, he thinks not only in paragraphs, he thinks in full pages, right? In a sense, and you have to be on top of this this dialectical negation that he's performing at so many levels. So all to say, the question of language not being able to be co-opted and used, and what do we really mean by the communication? Is Kittler a kind of an avant-gardist vis-a-vis the cybernetic space that has been created? Is he offering us something to really work with? I find some very, very interesting moments here in terms of, new things for the archive and all of that. And is the archive now a political space, in a different way than it has been in the past? And what does it mean to be literate today as well? So anyway, I have these thoughts, and maybe we can go back to Kittler's attempt to look at Heidegger, the Age of the World picture. That's one of the readings for tonight, as well as some of the later sections on optical media. Yeah, and I find, again, if you haven't read Thomas Pynchon, worth reading for what might possibly come down between Russia and the U.S. We're reliving some very strange moments here, in terms of the nuclear threat in many ways. So anyway, so those are just some preliminary statements for tonight. Anybody want to take a shot at what you're taking from this, and if it's the value, if you will, to put it in more socialized, social terms, social relational terms. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
Michael, I've been reading, I think I mentioned to you, Harney and Moten's new book,
Yeah.
All Incomplete.
Yeah.
And there's an interesting line in there. They're studying in part, at least, the algorithm.
Yeah, let me just turn off my phone.
Okay.
Everything's starting like crazy. Yeah. Let me just turn it off completely. Yeah.
And one of the things they say is, well, there's two things that kind of resonated in an interesting way with Hitler.
Right.
One was that, like, the algorithm is the first machine that isn't a human, that is meant to just create other machines.
Right.
And then the other thing they mention is that, like, it's also, we're in a time now with the way that algorithms manipulate emotions and the way they work on our psyches, that is happening independently. It's like innovations in machines and in technology that happen independently of the class struggle, or almost in a preemptive relation to the class struggle, right? Like, so I thought that was interesting because it's like positioning machines in relation to machines in the same way that Kittler does, right? Especially when he's talking about Daguerre and the daguerreotype.
Yes.
And also that point about the class struggle, I think is really productive in a certain way, because then it's like I mean, you sound like a conspiracy theorist when you say they, right? But something has been learned along the way, such that, like, these manipulations, these sorts of machinations behind the scene are happening in advance of any, and perhaps even in anticipation of any type of rebellion or revolt or.
So let me just back up for a second, since you brought up class struggle. I mean, the only person that really mentions of the readings we've done the notion of class and class struggle is Walter Benjamin, right? And it's a manifesto of the class. Heidegger never mentions class struggle. For him, the struggle is between ideas, right? And ontologies, and fundamental and foundational ontology is really the struggle that Heidegger goes through, at least early in his career. And then, of course, you see in Stiegler, there's no mention of really class. And what you're saying is interesting in the sense that Friedrich Kittler doesn't really mention class either, per se. So maybe what we're speaking of here is, in terms of this positioning of a new agency or avant-garde, that class really hasn't entered the picture yet, right? As you said, kind of preemptive, right? And that space needs to be built again in a very different language and in a different approach that allows a new kind of class struggle and class relations to develop. I mean, is that sort of where you want to go with this, or Fred and Stefano want to go?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. No,
I don't know if that's where they want to go with it. I know, like, in The Soul at Work, by Bifo Berardi.
Right.
He's talking more about like the way that this sort of collective class of knowledge workers becomes a new type of class, and then the way that like one can think about, instead of the means of production being any physical thing, you can think about your emotions and your mind and the way that your intellect is operating as part of the means of production in this sort of transversal, dispersed sense, right? Which then has different implications for what a class is, right? So,
to me, there's
so I
work
don't know. I'm
going
just
on in that domain, the emotional labor, of course, and also affect theory at this point.
right.
A lot of
Yeah.
people.
So for me, it's not like it's not like looking for those moments in these texts. It's more like, how can I mine them in a certain way for like a leftist, agenda. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. No, it's good. I mean, I'm glad you brought that up. To me, I mean, I think one reason they don't speak about class and class struggle is they are trying to, create a new space, right? This is really new topology at work, especially in Heidegger, but really also Stiegler as a contemporary who knows class and knows class art. I mean, he knows this very well. At the same time, and Kittler, I mean, of course, growing up in East Germany for 12 years of his life and understanding the divide, understands this very well. The thing is that they don't mention it in their work. It's not like, an Aronowitz, how class works, or, other people that have written about class, and in banal ways, knowledge and class, like our friend Rick Wolf back in the day on epistemological problems with class. And so anyway, I mean, this is a good opening in a sense. What is there, this new space being, Carl, you have to unmute.
I had a question. I lost connection for a while, but I heard what you were saying about that you were reading this book, and they were talking about the new technologies and algorithms as preemptive. And I wonder, did this was Fred Moten, and did they talk at all about, trying to rethink the train of class struggle that these technologies make possible? Or, I mean, class is constantly being transformed in certain ways, although I would say as a Marxist that there are certain fundamental, constituents of what we would, from a Marxist perspective, think of as class, and its forms of struggle and conflict also change. There are certain enduring aspects. Wage struggles is a class struggle, but I don't know. I'm just
But
curious.
even there, one has to then start like, okay, so there's the wage, but then one also has to start thinking like, what is productive labor in the digital realm, and like, is that only sort of determined by our interaction with a boss, right, which is the classical sort of orientation, or with capital, right? Or is it sort of, again, this more dispersed node structure that's horizontal and just sort of extracting lots of moments of profit from all sorts of human activity? I mean, that's something that they're also, I think, trying to get at. I mean, at least that's what I take from their book. But yeah, I don't know, something I'm struggling with myself, I think.
Yeah, Richard, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to say, as a kind of paradigm for me, is going back to this idea of technology as coming from this Greek word cognate, of the Greek verb to give birth, tikto,
Right.
and then the idea of maiutics in philosophy, to give birth, that one draws out. So this notion of giving birth. So somehow from technology, and then I also think of young people. In my who I run into in their passion for computer games, for communicating using these, what you could say are the descendants. I mean, it's such a short time between Kittler and now, or even more so from Stiegler to now, and yet there seems to me to be a transformation, or a quicker transformation into the use of technology in terms of image technology, media technology. So I, again, I keep thinking that I keep hearing in Stiegler's use of Greek of techne, and in politics, a kind of a foreshadowing that, in the sense of pharmacon, of poison that could be a medicine, or must also be a medicine, that somewhere in technology, in the ability to create some radical possibility within this technology. And then the other thing that comes to mind for me is, in my own personal interest, or what is this idea that the term comes from Godard, but I see it very much in a lot of our reading of this notion of the reality of the image and the image of reality, that of somehow, or what Godard calls thinking through the image. That's what he is really his idea in Histoire, which is using the archive of cinema. It really is taking the whole history, the archive, and using it, as he says, provisionally, to try to think through the image in some way. And so somewhere in there, I guess if I had to put an image to it, if I had to film it, it would have some things, it would have elements of the Matrix, I mean, but it would have elements of people working from computers in ways that can undermine or transform, disrupt the model of, you can call it capitalism, or also I think is interesting is Varoufakis in terms of techno-feudalism, that you have, this growing precariat who have computers and have access to knowledge in an extraordinary way. I mean, we can all now, for nothing, get a hold of, or practically nothing, Heidegger, or even recent lecture, or even this talk, even this conversation we're having today. So that kind of random intersections, chance intersections on smaller scales. I watched a football game. I did watch a football game this weekend.
Which one?
Oh, it was really great. I was for the Bengals, and oh man, it was a great game. But it's so overwhelming. I spend so little time in that space of, I don't know how to describe it, but these advertising and the way it constructs who it's addressing is just it's almost traumatizing, or it's just really tough to take, and it kind of pushes itself as being, for everyone out there,
Right.
and everyone is, quite a, it's inclusion. It's definitely in part Trump land. And so, I kind of like the idea of these smaller kind of things that are happening in nooks and crannies, and the possibilities there of almost like the virus of almost mutations that are unplanned, but have a kind of that take off in a certain way, in ways that can't be predicted. But
so, I mean, let me just go back to this. I mean, this is very interesting, at least to, certainly to me. If we take a little bit of a step back, I mean, we can talk about, Richard, you may be thinking of the old, and the new together in terms of what used to be called pockets of resistance, little small mutations, without any kind of general organization, but there were pockets of resistance that crept up and, would confront the system, and you had small groups that did so in many ways. And that, to me, that's very interesting. What does that mean? I like this phrase of Stiegler, the workers of the book. This is a very interesting phrase that one should use, in a sense. I have people that very good friends that work on Nietzsche seriously. And, of course, Nietzsche was talking about a kind of, aristocratic spirit, right? That needed to go back. That was this radical aristocraticism. And obviously, Domenico Lasorda, who passed away recently, wrote a book on Nietzsche, the aristocratic rebel, in a sense. It seems to me one pocket of resistance, and what you're talking about is this learning to read again, or the workers of the book, right? Yeah. Not only just the writers of the book, but the real workers of the book. I like this phrase very much. To me, it hits home. I consider my union is the Deconstructionist Workers of America, the DWA, right? That's my union going forward. Not the IWW, it's the Deconstructionist Workers of America. So anyway, I'm playing, but at the same time, I think it's interesting for us to, kind of think in this notion, and of course the reality of image, and, which is more Kittler than it is of Stiegler in some ways, right? Kittler is really taking up the optical, right? Again, this long narrative of the eye and the inventions. And even though Stiegler is there as well, but, and Heidegger is about, what happened to the ear. We don't hear. We can't hear anything differently. I had the first time I could sit back and really listen to some good jazz. I found William Parker's, I recommend this highly to people that like jazz, William Parker's orchestra in Milan in 2012. I forgot the title of the concert, but he does Ellington, The Essence of Ellington. And that was the title. And he does a version there called Take the Coltrane. And he and Hamid Drake, it's a bass and drums. And I've never heard, finally my ear kind of got unblocked, right? Where it's been blocked with too much, teaching or too much, nonsense in the everyday. But really, you got this idea of this transformative moment that really great music, if you really listen, I don't mean just listen, but really listen. And so for me, these are the things that, have this, which you were talking about, Richard, this mutation, sets up nice pockets of resistance. I guess the question is, do we take a step back, and does avant-garde, what does that mean today? Does that mean that people of, quote, educated intelligence, enlightened reason, versus, despotism or techno-feudalism are able to, create these pockets for themselves? But what does that mean in terms of movement as left politics. I think Tony, is reading that too. What does that mean for if there is such a thing as class struggle anymore, in the Marxist tradition, in a way? That's another issue. Certainly, if you look globally, yes, of course, we can see this, but what is really going on in this constant digitalization and redigitalization? And also, I want to point out, going back to video games, Microsoft last week or the week before purchased Activision Blizzard, one of the biggest makers of video games. So not only now does Microsoft have the software, right? Now they have the video game network as well. Yeah. And this is very, very interesting, that you're creating this. I follow this. Microsoft stock at the time of the Obama, the debacles was in the 20s. It's 1,000% higher and going higher right now. So this is why, Gates is, continually being in the top 3 of the billionaire class or whatever because of, stock value. But this accumulation is nonstop. So how again, what does it mean to be a left, number one? And number two, what does it mean to, really be agency at this point? Does agency reduce us again to Fred and Stefano, who I admire deeply? We had Stefano on prosperity Marxism, and fugitive education is great. I mean, they're really smart guys. They're kind of like the American version of Deleuze and Guattari, in a way, playing off of each other, talking heads, and they're very good at this. But at the same time, what does that mean? this fugitive education, and does it put it down? I'm searching. I'm telling you, I don't have the answers here.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that when you're talking and what Richard said and Tony, I mean, it seems like it's almost another seminar that would be very productive to try and look at, exactly these issues. What is productive labor? How do we understand class? How does class intertwine or intersect with other, identities that people struggle around these days or articulate? I mean, Richard, when you were talking, there's certainly, I think, another way I often have heard this come up, not so much as pockets of resistance, but prefiguration. So this is like a very used term in certain social movements, particularly of, kind of anarchist bent or anarchist identity, which is the idea is that, rather than trying to take over state power, you actually you prefigure alternative sets of social relations in the here and now through actual practice. And there's something very, appealing about it. But I think, it does get back to these questions of when, the capitalist system is so effective at appropriating and co-opting and integrating even, the ostensible opposition, it becomes hard to think about, how do those things congeal? I mean, there's Hart and Negre in their book Commonwealth also talk a lot about this, of sort of like these dispersed struggles, these dispersed agents, but then they kind of in some sense conjoin into the formation of the multitude. So there's a lot of particularly the Italian thinkers, there's been a lot of work like this. But for me, I kind of come down, I think where Michael comes down around this is that, how does this relate to the question of organization and power? And, that, I mean, fundamentally, the boss may be more occluded, but anyone who's working in a big tech company certainly experiences the boss. I mean, I know people who do.
Yes.
And, so it's kind of like, the world
the whole thing about creating the alternatives through, what you said, prefigurative politics or pockets of resistance, whatever language we choose here. But anyway, I know something about
and in film,
but yeah.
Just in culture, like just one thing that I don't know if this is still the term that's used, but certainly 3-4 years ago, culture jamming was very popular as, amongst filmmakers and artists. And I actually, have a space at a place here, Artist Television Access, where there are a lot of people who are into this, which is the idea of taking what the system sort of is constantly spewing and using it in ways that undermine its intent. right? So in some ways, it is the notion of an avant-garde. It is sort of like you're both inside, but you're totally subverting its logics, its meanings, its intents.
Right.
And, again, some of it's, great and
The
inspiring.
problem with jamming is it's always this kind of an inverted,
Right.
world, and that's not enough.
Right.
We're
Right.
really the inverted world is not enough, as Josh, knows with Peter Berger's work on the avant-garde, the logic and the theory of the avant-garde. How do you avoid, this is really, I think, a major question, just like what Richard brought. Commercials used to be much better in football games. I was astonished. I'm a big fan of Cincinnati because of the LSU connection with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, and I can go through the whole. But anyway, but anyway, I was astonished at the level of the commercials. This is at the most primitive level, compared to even 5 years ago, much less 20 years ago, where you could see some sophistication. There's no sophistication anymore. It's just the product is in your face. Right?
Yeah.
It's just jammed down your throat, right? And et cetera. Yeah. So anyway, I mean, our problem really, in a sense, is not so much just the jamming, but how do you get to another side where you can code without it being appropriated? I mean, they basically have they, meaning, and going back to what Tony said, and a funny story football about that was Frank Gifford, who used to announce the Monday Night Football when that first came into existence, used to say, "Yes, Virginia, there is a they." That was the slogan that the pro football, there is a they, right? There is a conspiracy, right, in a sense, which is, part of the battle. But anyway, that's another course. But
or even if it's not,
yeah,
if it's not a conspiracy, the effects are the same on society.
Exactly. And, Heidegger, this Patrick knows, has a whole section on the dictatorship of the they self in being in time. Yeah. I mean, this is really what he was confronting in some ways, was this mass-induced, thing. I mean, this is why he makes statements, in my mind, what parades as National Socialism is not good enough to have the planetary encounter with technology. He said this. He couldn't stand this mass communication, this mass cybernetics in a way. He had to, yeah. Anyway, so, a great essay would be Heidegger against Goebbels. But anyway, that would be a very interesting study. But yeah, Richard, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm just
no. I would.
Yeah,
maybe I would
meet Drake's drums. Yeah, right.
Maybe I would name my resistance group Epsilon.
Okay.
Get a little ahead of Omicron.
Okay.
In other words, the virus is pretty damn successful.
Yeah.
The virus has been pretty damn successful. If you want a model of something that successfully undermines,
right?
And I mean, the French came up with this idea of collapsology. That basically these long chains of supply would eventually break down. And I mean, they've been proven to be not, a little overly apocalyptic, but still not too far from the mark, not totally off the mark.
Right.
And which is just to say, in this idea of prefiguration, that you have, you work with a small group, a cell, right? What the communists used to call, you work with your cell. Your cell. There we go. There's another good metaphor. You work with your cell. And, you come up with because there's something about working with a small group. This is something also that I once, through my frequenting psychoanalytic conferences and such, that rather than just thinking of a group or the individual, think about sizes, what small groups can do. So some, different size groups that then can join together for,
Right.
that in this set of permutations, and you can, again, maybe we should all wear a little, as people wear crosses, we should wear a little Omicron, like this is, in other words, it is not out of, it doesn't always work as they planned.
Right.
Well,
And-
the Bolsheviks did have cells. There were Bolshevik cells. So.
yeah, oh yes, I know. Listen, I
That's why I
remember,
use the metaphor. Yeah.
oh yeah, I know. That's what I was saying. Listen, I remember
Imperial metaphor.
in France having communist cells. I always knew I could sell at least one full house of a theater to my friend. Her, the whole cell would show up. The communist cell. They would show up, and I knew I had one full house. So no, I mean, yeah, absolutely. There really were cells. I mean, that really is. I'm aware of that. So you have groups working, bringing together their skills. You stay that way. You don't get overly depressed and run down. I mean, or at least you have some.
Sorry, you guys go ahead. I just have to catch this. I'm sorry. Yeah. Please. Yeah.
I think there's something to be said for small working groups, on the model of, again, I'm using the model of the virus, but also of this idea of permutations. You have various different permutations, and some are more successful than others, and then something catches on, something explodes. And because of the timing, because of, nothing that's necessarily, but this is what I'm wondering, I mean, or this is one idea that comes to my mind. And that even, Godard, when he was working with the Gorsian, not with Gors, Andre Gors. No, I'm thinking of someone else he's working with. But
Garan, maybe Andre Garan.
Yes, thank you.
Pierre Garan, Pierre, I think was his name.
Yeah, but this kind of where he kind of withdrew, and then they were doing, and which really was, to a large degree, was seen in the aftermath as a failure, but gave birth, Maeutics again, gave birth to a new way of working that's reflected in his later work, which works with cheaper equipment, takes advantage of really what we would call consumer equipment or prosumer equipment, and is very accessible in a certain way, and deals with kind of a poetic discourse. And the other thing I was going to say, talking about jazz, was also, two great people come to mind here. Is always this thing that's always interested me about Freud and taking from Judaism listening, the idea that the Hellenic tradition, the Greek tradition, is about the eye, and the idea of listening as what somehow unchanged, or that the imaginary, or the way that people would get fixated on images, and by listening to bring it back to language in a way, and then on a cinematic level, Orson Welles, who really, came out of radio in a way, continued to have this relationship to sound, but that's more of a technical or stylistic choice, which I think has its limits, but nevertheless, in thinking about working with sound in a certain way, music, sound, music again being something obviously hugely, it's to be something that's constantly being transmitted.
Mhm. It's interesting, Richard, when you use the metaphor or the term of the virus. I mean, kind of what it brought to my mind is, I mean, yes, there's sort of like this idea of things are diffuse, they're distributed. There's all these smaller pockets. You can actually think of, the individual viral cells that are undergoing processes of mutation, right? And that and the older model, of political organization, I think this is still true in a lot of, political organizations. I think it's true in a lot of right-wing political organizations, is that you may have cells, but they're very much subject to a centralized command, that's very top. It's a transmission. And then, there's sort of like the idea that there's feedback, right? That it's not just one way, but, that's always been, I think, a problem of political organizations. But then the other thing I thought is that, the limit of that is that the virus can't kill the host. The virus kind of needs the host to kind of reproduce enough that, like, right, you don't kill the host. And those of us who are, anti-capitalist or whatever you want to call it, we kind of want to kill the host. So, it's sort of an interesting metaphor. And then I guess, the other thing, that to me, I mean, I don't know enough about media technologies and certainly computers or, what can be done in terms of disrupting. I mean, it seems like a lot of, there's a lot of disruption and hacking and, subterfuge going on, a lot of it criminal. But to me, I guess I just feel like, a transformative moment would still involve the ability to shut down production, or maybe we can talk about shutting down reproduction, right? I mean, fundamentally, capital can integrate anything except when you actually stop its ability to produce and realize value. That's when it kind of begins to die. And, I think about that a lot. Like, I mean, are there ways outside the traditional workforce where those types of stoppages could take place? And
Well, David Harvey, or not David Harvey, Varoufakis says that actually, the word hasn't gone out, but actually capitalism died.
That's
It died
that's one.
in the sense that what you have now is kind of, well, he's I wouldn't just reject it out of hand. I mean, in the sense that, they're just the central banks are just printing. Well, I mean, we'll see what happens now, but are just printing money. And that you have kind of a feudal system where you have like a kind of leadership, which is like in a gated community. And that there really is none of which is an interest. I wouldn't say, but it's an interesting idea in terms of, a kind of Aikido way of destroying capital, or, or an interesting way of thinking of the problem. His thing is, again, that we actually are in something worse than capitalism, but that you have a kind of technological, what he calls technological feudalism. Although I agree we would have to look at that in some way. But then yes, David Harvey, who says, look, once upon a time, a certain part of the workers were caught up in feeding, in agriculture. But now technology is so radically impregnated in the life of so many, to talk about the destruction or closing down of technology for any length of time would result in such, mass death on such level, that, you really need to think about it in some other way. I mean, the Detroit, the auto workers in Detroit, the black revolutionary workers, they really saw their linchpin, their position in terms of technology, that they could shut down the technology. And David Harvey's point is that the technology now is so involved. I mean, this is also what Zizek says about, this kind of purist notion. If nature is a mother, she's one hell of a motherfucking mother. And you can't, the idea that you're going to get back to a purist, that in some way you need technology to sustain artificially this constructed notion of nature and such. So, again, I get back to this. I'm not at all personally, I don't, when I hear that Microsoft now owns the biggest game company, that doesn't surprise me or in any way, I don't see that as a devastating.
Not surprising.
Not surprising, and doesn't necessarily close off or foreclose, resistance or the continuation of snafu. Systems normal all fucked up.
Yeah. Well, I think like Michael Hudson has a similar thing about techno-feudalism in the rentier society, that basically, we have gone back in a sense to feudalism, only there's this attempt to hold on to the monopolies, the rentier sense of it, through, this concept of intellectual property rights, right? And that basically, capitalism was supposed to get rid of feudalism. It was supposed to get rid of the rentier class. And the Marx's idea was that, okay, that we're going to pass through this, that capitalism is going to get rid of the rentier class, the people who dominate the land, who dominate the property. And, from there, we're going to pass into socialism, which obviously hasn't happened. So we're kind of stuck in the Western countries, Europe, United States, and the people that are running the economy through through the financial system based out of New York. There's this attempt to just complete, the financialization of the society has become such that it's kind of closing in on itself, and that Hudson sees the Chinese as actually an attempt to move beyond that. The fact that they're trying to close down their own financialization tendencies with closing down Jack Ma, and not closing him down, but definitely trimming his feathers, and keeping the keeping the financial class from gaining control of society the way it has here. And so it's an interesting, interesting phenomenon. And the technology has in some ways enabled that. And so you have, what he calls and what Varoufakis calls techno-feudalism, because the people who control the bits and bytes being generated, at the Federal Reserve are basically in control of society.
But see, I think that's all really interesting. I guess just off the top though, I would that there's a lot of things that have been raised. Do we still live under capitalism or something else? But just I think it's important not to sort of refer the issue of domination to technology per se, because I think that a lot of what we today call financialization, another way to read the history of the present, is that it emerged out of defeats that were imposed on popular movements, third world liberation struggles, organized labor, etc. And that it's those political defeats, I mean, certainly in this country, that occurred through Reagan. I mean, that was kind of the turning point, is actually what gives rise to many of these things. If you look at, for instance, a chart of debt in the US, the ratio of debt to GDP, it's kind of going up a little bit. 1980, it explodes. And it's kind of exploded ever since. And so there was clearly not suddenly a computer system or a technology that allowed that explosion to take place. It was clearly, in my opinion, it was clearly political and social, and those types of things I think are more fundamental in my thinking about how we understand the present. And techno-feudalism is I'd love to read this stuff. It sounds like a very interesting concept. I think, to me, like, I would still say we live in a capitalist society. I think that for me, there is a dissipation and a growing pathology. So like what Michael was saying, or somebody was saying, it's just like pumping in all this, money into the system that is just kind of, in some sense, the system's on life support. And capitalism does not seem capable of sort of an endogenously generated revival at this point. And the Keynesian mechanisms don't seem capable of bringing about, so there's I think anyone who's looking at this system right now must realize, that there's something very, very wrong. And that's one of the things I liked about Stiegler, was that I think he was trying to kind of get at something similar to that, of this kind of dissipation, this sort of, and how we kind of connect what Stiegler is doing to financialization and these other issues is interesting, because he doesn't really talk about, the limit I see in Stiegler is he doesn't talk about politics really. It's all kind of in terms of techniques and memory and those type of things, but there's not really, I think, a good analysis of class struggle, whatever you want to call it, power relations and the restructuring of everyday life that's occurred in the last 40 years.
Yeah, I think what you were referring to, Richard, was a recent interview that was done by Varoufakis, who talks about this kind of techno-feudalism. But the interview also talks about that this is essentially built upon a capitalist system, which relies on the generation of surpluses. It's just a matter of the way in which they're distributed. And I think going back to, the issue of agency, if we go back into history in terms of understanding, I think that we can learn something. Marx, it was the wood theft laws. Lenin, it was peace, bread, land. We can go, and then we, May 68, even though it basically was co-opted in many ways, pointed to the issue of technology That's been played out. The precarity that exists, the Occupy movement essentially pointed to, that there was, capitalism is not, capitalism is never imbalanced. It is constantly, as Harvey points out, value in motion. And so there is this element here that this instability that exists. I mean, in the contemporary period, it's this precarity. I mean, in my experience, as an educator, retired, but still involved, very much involved in the MTA in Massachusetts, it's the way in which neoliberalism is sticking its blood funnel, to use a metaphor from Taibbi, into the education system to try and extract, surplus. And it's basically initiating a revolt among teachers in terms of the way in which it's taking over the education process. I think we all work in our specific areas hoping that this would be the kind of weak link in the chain. And it does happen, but we really can't predict where it's going to happen. We can only point out the fragility of the system, at this particular point in time, in terms of its different areas, and call attention to that. So.
Mm-hmm.
And Stiegler did,
He did. Yeah.
work in these communities on kind of on a very local level. I mean, he was, I can't remember the name of the part of the town outside of Paris that he was working on in the last years of his life, in kind of this whole transformation of everyday life. But he did try to address that, at least in some of his projects, including education, which you can find, as somebody pointed out, these great resources that you can find online. Not unlike this, he did all these lectures, and they're all still up there and with the students, and he really was, basic introductions to philosophy, the classics, or what, ancient Greek, and what was that?
The thing.
Oh, I know what I was going to say was, in terms of another thing is that he wrote this book called What Makes Life Living? What makes life worth living, which is addressed mainly to young people. And it's very interesting, again, I think this idea of being, that part of sustaining life is sustaining, some reason to continue thinking, besides everything else, to continue reading. So those kinds of, so I think that's an important thing to address in this, in the age of distraction, where, there's kind of, with autocorrect and such, and the kind of, you're more and more, it's almost you're taken away from you. You're writing, in a sense, or your sense of autonomy in relation to writing and the book and such. And so he did talk about that, and I think it's another reason to think about these models of, smaller units. I agree that you need something much bigger than that at some point, but, and some of it, it has to be some kind of a dialectic between, something much larger going on and something then much more particular going on. But, working in these smaller groups, is a very interesting model Um,
Yeah, I think sorry, Carl, but you mentioned also before the Italian post-Marxists and things like this. One thing that I got from them, from reading them for a couple of years now, is this idea that we can in some ways anticipate what capital is going to do by sort of calibrating and positioning the position of the workers, I mean, however you take that term, in a way that refuses certain imperatives capital is imposing, and then thus changes the way that capital is going to structure itself, while at the same time that recomposes the class, right? Bifo talks about the Italian post-Marxist tradition not as post-Marxist but as compositionist, right? So what type of composition of the class does each change instantiate, and then how do you not bemoan that and say, oh, I wish I were what I was before, but use it and occupy it and push through it, right, to even further refusals, further kinds of rebellions that make use of the new ways you've been composed or constructed or whatever, right? And I think that the material changes you're talking about with debt, right, and with the history of industrial capitalism, the thing that all that shares in common with the technological changes, I think, is they're presupposing a specific type of consciousness, and which is what Stiegler, I think, is getting at. A specific type of subjectivity that is disciplined enough to pay off your debt and is self-interested and acquisitive and shares certain values, right, with the people imposing these systems on us, right? So that's what's so interesting to me about this mutational thing that you're pointing to, Richard, is how do we then, and very much in line with the Italian post-Marxist thinkers, right? How do we then manipulate consciousness and subjectivity in such a way that it exceeds what capital has expected from us thus far, while at the same time recognizing that we're also sort of stuck in it, right? And can use it as a source of power. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it does. I guess it's but yes, no, that's actually really interesting. I guess for me, there's still the image of how do you actually shut the system down in a way that's actually linked to a set of radical demands to radically transform it. And it's I was listening to what's her name, Greta Thunberg, and she was talking about this recent. She's still in the role of a sort of the child addressing the adults, you've ruined the world and now you need to fix it. And I was thinking, well, it will be great when and if she gets to the point of you've ruined the world, you can't fix it, give us the control of the means of production. Basically, we need to expropriate you and completely transform. And so I think that no one is in my that tradition you're talking about, I think is very interesting and rich, and there's a lot to draw from it, but I've never really seen any way to think through how you move from the cell, the kind of viral model of a sort of dispersed resistance, right, that's kind of constantly mutating and needs to be adaptable and kind of flexible to kind of what it's immediately encountering. That larger moment, right, which seems to me it still needs, we can't do away with that conception,
right,
sort of the revolutionary.
I mean, one way
Go ahead. I just wanted to catch up, but go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I'll just say this and then
we're trying to call.
But yeah, it was just one way that I remember, I think from Tronti's book, was that being excluded. So say you everybody goes on strike, and then whatever the classic sort of thing happens, like they come up with some machine that replaces you, so your strike becomes nullified or whatever, right?
Mhm.
There, he was writing that like perhaps this is a source of strength, perhaps not having anything in common with capital's plans becomes a sort of praxis in itself. And like I don't know how to concretize that in the ways that you're talking about necessarily, but like some examples were the auto reduction movements in Italy in the 70s, where people got together and decided to just pay less, a lot less, for their electricity bills en masse, in a way that was like, no, these are, you know, forwarding our desires over the, you know, the whatever the demands that are being imposed upon us, or like these, they would all go to the supermarket and in groups, and then, you know, say, no, this bag of groceries doesn't cost what you say it costs. This is what we're going to pay you. You know, too bad. Deal with it, right? Or like you know, things like this that are like, we decide the price, and you know, so thinking of the class in sort of these dynamic ways as not just a producer but a consumer, and in consuming you're also producing. So things like this, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
I mean, just as concrete ways.
It seems like you guys have started to think about how would we map out a new world of associated producers, right, in a certain way. I mean, you know, Marx's call for, you know, the first step of a communist society is really to be built on an associated world of producers. I think part of the problem, at least to my mind, is going back. I mean, I recently revisited Jonah Will Be 25 in the year 2000, which is a remarkably beautiful film, especially the sections on the folds of history and the sausage. And I mean, you know, it's sometimes good to go back to these futures past and what he does. But if you remember the end of that film, and I suspect everybody's seen it or knows of it, the end of the film is the character Matthew. Everybody has the letter M in their name. That's Marco, Matthew, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And the millennium, 2000, right? Jonah Will Be 25 then. But at the end, it's really Matthew, the worker, who has created the alternative space of learning and gives a wonderful explanation of inflation to the young people on the farm, you know, where they're all congregating. You know, he goes back on his bicycle going back to work. And what he does in a kind of realist moment is say, I have this new consciousness that I've acquired, you know, through this. And I go back to work without any illusions about what's happening here, you know, et cetera. And this is interesting that kind of closed off, in a way, the 70s, that the struggle is going to be long, right? It's going to be very long. So again, I want to point, I mean, I know Carl studies this somewhat, and I'm sure other people in the room, this whole thing about financialization of everyday life, you know, this thing about, you know, why this inflation is coming up. We've had inflation for a very long time. We've had asset inflation. Look at housing costs. Look at the cost of basic things, right, that we've had to have to do. Healthcare, right? Education in the United States. 3 moments of crucial: your shelter, right? Your educational moment, and your healthcare. 3 basic rights that have become a privilege to a very few without becoming indebted. At the same time, the creation of the financial architecture has increased from just a few $1 trillion to $400 trillion of financial assets globally. 400 trillion, yeah, globally. So we have that happening as well. So we have to think this through in a kind of new, I mean, one of the things that impresses me both about Stiegler and Kittler is that they seem not to want to go back, right? They're not, there's not a nostalgia here at all. And I just picked up a book when I'm sorry for the interruption again. I have a kind of a, obligation to someone who has very, very big issues with the COVID and other thing, who's actually teaching a class of big band. She actually played with William Parker, speaking of Parker, and Hamid Drake in a trio many years ago. But anyway, I'm sorry for the interruption, but it was necessary. But anyway, I picked up a book. It's called Deep Time of the Media, which is a kind of post-Hitlerian moment. And the author is Siegfried Zielinski, Siegfried Zielinski, Zielinski, towards an archaeology of hearing and seeing by technical means. And Richard, you'll be interested. He has a great quote from Godard in his concluding chapter, a proposal for a cartography mapping. And we get this cognitive mapping from, I don't think Jameson invented it, but he put it out there to a group of Marxist literary, critics. He begins with the things are here, right? And why invent them? It's kind of interesting that Godard would say this. He says this in Elegy for Love, right? Very recent one of his, and I think in 2004 or 3, I forgot exactly when he did it, but
Right, yeah.
recent time, right? So interestingly enough, I think again, part of the question to me, or the questioning the path, is I love the Italian autonomists. I grew up with Negre, Tronti, these people, the Italian neorealist cinema, the correlations between this. I'm very interested in Esposito, biopolitics, and the kind of moves that happen, Bifo on another level, a celebrity intellectual, et cetera. All these things, Agamben, who's off the wall at certain points at this point, but again, a great, a very interesting thinker. But all to say, it seems to me we're at a moment now where we have to think this very differently, and this kind of new technical means of production. And it's not so much about the old language of we're taking hold of just the means of production or whatever, or just these, kind of, again, prefigurative politics. What does it mean, the political today? These to me are very, very serious questions.
Michael, let me.
Go ahead, Carl.
No, I like. See, I think for me, though, it's also important not to sort of adopt the standpoint that everything is new and we have to totally rethink everything. A lot of what, a lot of the work that I've done recently looking at finance has actually been to argue that in some sense it's just old wine in a new bottle. And that there was at one point you'd go to conferences or you'd listen and people would, the Italians were Maserati was doing this, and other people, that everything's been, we can't think about value through the old categories. It's diffuse. Value is created through all the, every activity in society. There's all these notions of co-production. And, I tried to sit down and sort of think this through in kind of a systematic way, not just sort of the gestural. And so all I'm saying, I agree that, we need to constantly be rethinking, but it's not always clear to me when people say, the nature of value has totally changed in a capitalist society. I actually don't think that. And it's not always clear to me what people mean when they say, the nature of the political has radically altered. It still seems to me it's fundamentally about power and who has power through the existing institutions of the society at root. And, this, I'm not arguing with you. I'm just saying, I think it's important to kind of clarify what are we really talking about. Stiegler has a certain political.
Well, I'm talking about a shift that's taken place, and I'll take up Hilferding against Lenin here in some ways, that you basically have the shift to finance capital, which now reasserted its muscle in a very different way through fictitious capital. And nothing is really tied like it used to be to production, right? You have this disconnect that's going on. right? That is consistent. That's what I mean about things. When you talk about, that you're talking about, let's just put this into historical perspective from the capitalist standpoint. The capitalists can argue we had a Dow Jones Industrial Average during a big crisis in Watergate that was less than 1,000, right? Back in the day, in Richard Nixon's time. We had multiple administrations, but now that Dow Jones averages is 35,500, which does not include the dividends that were paid out, et cetera. Now, this is the creation of capital, right? In some way, right? And fictitious capital, fictitious or real, it doesn't really matter, right? In a sense, right? What has really occurred? At the same time, we have all this new technocratic, right, to talk about power, a new form of power that, Claude Shannon probably anticipates, certainly the cyberspace, the IBM machine that Kittler refers to. All of these things are coming to fruition in our moment, right? In a sense. To me, it seems to me the task is to get out of the old category. I'm fine with going back to the principles in or the critique of political economy and really start to look at value in terms of use and exchange value. But it seems to me we need another category to start talking about value that is not tied just to commodification or the commodity.
I think we need to do new work. I'm not saying we just dust off the old texts and recite them. But to me, if you really look at the financial sector, if there's asset inflation, all these other things, but ultimately what its problem is it's almost like fracking. Think of it as almost like fracking, like you run out of the easy sources of surplus value. So you need to go start exploring more and more and more and more these other mechanisms through which you can extract. So you put students into debt, you put governments into debt, that eventually exhausts itself. So you put and then all these sort of cycles of debt eventually collapse. So now, the Federal Reserve is, as you said earlier, is essentially maintaining this whole system. But underneath it today, I would still argue that fundamentally it's extracting value from the wage relation. What is paying off interest? It's a form of surplus value. And if you actually remove all that, the whole thing does at some point collapse, and that's what the Federal Reserve is trying to avoid. The point, we're getting kind of far afield from.
I understand, but I'm trying to.
I think we need to sort of. All I'm saying is that we need to not sort of make these broad gestures in terms of the novelty and newness, and understand what is the wage relation has been transformed, right? So how do we think about the
What do you mean it's been transformed into what? Obviously we all know that the wage relation is basically completely stagnant since the 70s. The union had, it's completely stagnant. That's it. It hasn't been transformed at all in any way.
Well, but how capital?
In fact, in real dollars, wage relation is declining in terms of the wage relations to capital.
But the way
worker, go ahead. I'm listening.
No. Just very simply though, there's a lot of things about that you could say, but I think that on one level, when we think about debt, that the importance of these secondary forms of exploitation that occur outside the direct point of production have become increasingly fundamental to supporting the ongoing viability of the system, and that at some point the system has, in my opinion, begun to reach the limits of these things. That it's not clear how much more debt Wall Street can impose on the American working class. It's just that, at some point it becomes an untenable project, and at that point it begins to hit its limit.
But Carl, this has been going on for 40 years.
Yes.
And there have been educational, moments within unions, within workers' collectives, et cetera, that have talked about this. There's been absolutely nothing but almost a kind of a complicity with capital on this, as long as my credit card still goes through the system, right? and I
Right.
pay a little bit and I don't get to the max, right, this month.
Right,
I
right.
can max it out and then I pay, next month and I may get a little bonus or I get this or whatever. See, to me, this is not, but at the same time, these corporations are issuing new debt structures, right, that are coming home back to them in terms of their earnings, their profit margins, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to look at this very squarely again, to my mind. I mean, this has been a 50-year TINA syndrome, much earlier than Thatcher said it, much earlier than Reagan implemented and Reagan-Thatcherism, policies. And I think we're living something much worse, that there is no alternative. There's no alternative, even with even more servility to the system, more docile bodies, to put it in Foucault's language, that have been created in the debt market.
Well,
So
no, but
again,
what you're
raised
saying-
here is the agency.
But look how tightly workers,
Yeah.
look how tightly workers are tied into financialization now. We get our wages cut because then we go look at our 401ks and our accounts and say, if it doesn't get higher, I can't retire. So therefore, you will cut your hand off to get.
Right. And don't worry, Jeff, Mr. BlackRock, Mr. Larry Fink and Mr. So-and-so, they're going to make sure your pension stays up there so you don't make too much noise, because they know the first thing you're going to do is pick up your IRA or your 401k or your TIA creft and say, how much did it grow? Right, in a sense.
Right. And by having and looking for growth, know that they destroy any disgruntlement with the system, and if you get too much disgruntlement, you're not going to get that growth.
Absolutely. I like the term, and I think this is original and something we need to think through, is Mauricio Lazzarato's term, forced financialization.
Yeah.
Forced financialization. It's just, this is used as a weapon, again, against wage labor. Yes, I agree with you, Carl. It's against the working class, of course, and the salaried employees. But at the same time, it's a forced financialization that has many, many dimensions to it.
But all I'm saying is that we don't need to completely abandon old concepts like, the limits to capital that are created by an insufficient.
There are no limits to capital.
Well, no, there are. I mean, when capital runs out of new sources of, I think that there is evidence that you can point to that, in fact, the system is beginning to encounter certain limits. The debt is continuing to grow, but non-financial debt. And financial debt is the kind of what you're talking about, where there's these restructurings through financial mechanisms that lead to asset inflation or the rearrangement. And that's
You're saying we're in one big Ponzi scheme.
We are in some way, and you can make money.
Other Italian, yeah.
Right, but you can make money in a Ponzi scheme up to a certain point. But when the Ponzi scheme comes to an end, it's a very, very different reality than if you've actually invested in infrastructure and buildings and factories and medicines and those types of things. It's a different reality. And so it should not be, there's just a lot of, but the point I'm making is that there is, you can theorize a limit, and you can theorize how, capital is, I mean, it's just what it's just done is broaden the sphere of appropriation. And I agree with you, Mike. I mean, I think you put it really well, that the way it reproduces its power over us is at the level of it's the micro level. It's the everyday life. It's what happens when you go into the work site, and then it's what happens when your credit card gets rejected, or you don't have a good credit rating, and then you can't go rent an apartment, right? So it's just like it's inundated itself but again, I'm just making the point that I find a lot of the categories of capital, when I really started to sit down and think about this stuff, very productive, like very, very, like much better than a lot of the new stuff that's been written, to think through it systematically, like what Marx does, which is like really make all the points of the argument connect, and that there are no presuppositions that are not initially also results, right? To really sort of, in that sense, try and be rigorous. So anyway, yeah.
Right. I mean, I'm all for Marx, right? I mean, I don't
no, I know.
Yeah.
But what I'm hearing from you, Michael, is that there is the financialization essentially has closed all exits.
Mm.
Yes.
It's the totally administered world
Yes.
of Adorno.
That's,
Whereas
I think it does.
from you,
Forced us
Carl, what
to
I'm
have
hearing
Yeah.
is
Go ahead,
reading
please.
Marx, there's a breakdown. Eventually, there's a limit where the system will break down.
Or I think maybe a better way of, I think this relates to Stiegler and maybe also Wolfgang Streck,
Yeah.
is that another way to think about it is almost dissipation. Like rather than sort of the traditional model of, the limit comes and boom, it all collapses, that what we seem to be actually seeing is more of a dissipation, more of a kind of a weakening and so yeah, there's all this asset inflation going on, but there's really nothing underneath it except the central banks.
Mhm.
I mean, that's the world we live in right now. It is utterly fictitious. That to me is a sign of exhaustion, not a sign of strength. If the system had been
It's a sign, it's a sign of exhaustion, but it's a sign of if the left can't, if we can't go through to socialism or whatever, it will find a way to pick up the pieces and restart the whole process again. It hasn't been invented yet, but that's what they're working on. This is where the Varoufakis interview is fairly interesting, because what he talks about is what he calls platform capitalism and social media, and the way in which it extracts surplus through us. I mean, basically the devices that we carry around, we think we use them. No, they use us. And in terms of what's going on.
Well, that's an open question. I think I agree. I think it's very much an open question whether those mechanisms will work. They do not show any evidence of it so far, in my opinion. I mean, we're not like at the cusp. We're well into the computer revolution, and there keeps being this discourse of, it's going to pull us out. It's going to pull us out. It's going to transform everything.
So I have sympathy with your argument.
It's not. I mean, I'm open, but it's not happening, right? I mean, we're kind of still waiting.
I mean, again, the question again, I mean, I'm not really in disagreement about that Marx gives us, enormous categories and systematic attempts at looking at the capitalist mode of production, which, by the way, he admired considerably too, and doing the critique as well. He was not a moralist. He's describing a system at work and does so better than anybody in a way. And the interconnectedness, and he only finished one volume of it. The rest is put together, as we know, by Engels, through, what Marx left as manuscripts, et cetera, volume 2, 3, and of course the theories of surplus value. And I mean, I think it's a good way to look at surplus and excess. Hence, we have a class that is, a TV podcast, called Prosperity Marxism, because we believe in abundance, and you need to begin there, not with scarcity. We're not the poverty pimps. We're not the poverty scholars, right? In some ways, we're thinking about abundance. And how do you really, again, think this through at that level? We're much more Bataillean, much more out of George Bataille's work, in terms of the accursed share, right? Think through this in terms of, societies of abundance, not the old categories of scarcity, in a sense. So anyway, but again, the question again to me is, never have we been so inundated, right? Where this is we're in a period, no matter how we temporalize it, in terms of we're dealing with periodization here at a point. We all, I think, agree we're in the epoch of technology, right? And that we're driven very much by this technology. I mean, I think Heidegger and others, have that point down. Stiegler is going to talk about the prosthesis. Kittler is going to talk more about, the aspect of seeing, right, through optical media, the history of inventions, and doing archaeology of how we perceive in certain ways, alongside these material objects. The question to me, once again, is how do you organize around this, right? Where is the left on this? We can't continually go back and say it's all in Marx. You know, this to me is because it isn't all in Marx, because Marx didn't live through this other thing. He gives us fundamental categories, of course, right? But you know, we're acting like we're, you know, a bunch of rabbis with the Old Testament, and this is always God's voice saying something that's always correct. Yes, I'm just saying we need to think beyond the horizon into where we are, right? Yeah. I mean, I understand wage labor very well. I understand the rates of exploitation very well. And I mean, I'm sure, you know, people can, you know, that are mathematically inclined can actually figure out rates of exploitation in terms of Microsoft and show the extraction of surplus value. But that does not diminish Microsoft's power. Microsoft and technology, you know, you do not have any organization of tech workers. You know, you don't have a union of tech workers, right? In many ways, very, very small in that respect. You know, what is going on in terms of mobilization against this, right? Against this beast. And you're right, Carl, they're going to restructure. They're thinking about ways to restructure this. The moves by the Fed is just a little icing, you know, a beginning of the icing on the cake of the long party that began back in 2008, 2009. Yeah, I mean, they pulled this off for 13 years. Now they have to take a back step, right? In a certain way. They're beginning to see signs of the breakdown. But at the same time, you know, if you really think this through, I mean, is this really just another blimp in the thing? We've had the crisis of 2001, 2008, 2009. We had the Asian contagion, 1998. You know, the 1990-91 problems before, the crash of 87, right? All of these things, right? Going back for a very long time. And we have something that's very interesting too. Most of us are sort of products or, you know, extensions, if you will, of the 60s. The 60s did not have inflation, right? In a way. You know, when you really think about that, when we came of age in a certain way, it was still affordable to do the things we could do in terms of thinking alternatives. That's another thing that's part of the forced laborization. And listen, I know it's extreme when Agamben talks about the new nomos as a concentration camp, but you could think of the new nomos as very much, as this kind of, wage slavery. Wage labor is slavery, right? In many ways. And that's what's really coming down at this point. So again, I'm asking the question, where is the left, right, in this? I mean,
Let me ask a question, like, how does this, to go back to kind of where we started, the question of the avant-garde and, back to what Richard was also raising about, these cells, which I think is a more, in my mind, sort of, well, I don't know, is it an avant-gardist model, to the idea of sort of the dispersed cells that are seeking new forms of life, seeking new forms of, I mean, I'm just sort of coming back, yes, but then what is the response, or how do we begin to think through what an adequate response might be, right?
Right. I'm gonna tell you a little story. I mean, I knew Paul Piccone pretty well when he was living in New York in the East Village, the person that formed Telos. Paul Piccone was a monster, right? He was a really tough Italian, who knew Enzo Paci translated that wonderful work on phenomenology and science, and he ran Telos with an iron hand, and he was really, in my opinion, one of the responsible parties for bringing Western Marxism in. We used to walk a little bit, in the East Village. And he would always have this thing about, the artists and the avant-garde are the shock troops which capitalism uses. And he used the East Village as a model. He says, you see what's happening in the East Village? Watch what happens now in terms of real estate interests. So he really understood this. I think we need to reconceive of the avant-garde in a certain way. Soho was a wreck until, certain people, it was a wreck. It was a, manufacturing, decline in a manufacturing district that became kind of a loft culture, which was predicated on the quote cool artists, that the Castelli, Leo Castelli starts with, and then it's brought around by our what's her name? Paula Cooper, the Greek. She's half Greek, right? The artistic gallery in Chelsea. So how do we think this through, right? I mean, in a sense, that's all. I'm plagued by this because again, I want to avoid avant-garde. To me means like an Adorno who can think through the negative all the way, the radical negative, to the point of where it can't be reduplicated by the system, and that sets up something radically different, or a Benjamin too, in a sense, right? That, you can use these forces for revolutionary purposes, like Richard was saying. Richard's position, I think, I mean, he can correct me if it's wrong, it's very Benjaminian here. Let's use these computer, right, things, for a few, future liberation in a certain way, right? And this seems to be what Benjamin is saying, in the work of art in the age of technical reproduction. So again, I raise these questions because I think you have to reinscribe. There are kids at Stanford Business School that read, probably Bernard Stiegler. They hear the word, they're going to go start reading. They don't read it like we read it, but they're there to appropriate it, right? This happens with Habermas. I've been in barroom fights almost about stuff like this, right? With kids that come out of, the Harvard Business School or, Stanford, how this is appropriated. So this also raises a question: what cannot really be appropriated by the system itself? Or what are the values that we hold? What do we stand for? What are we selling in a way? Jeff Lustig, who you may have known, Carl, who's on the West Coast, sociologist, we sent him the manifesto for a left turn. He says, what is the left offering? That was the first thing he said. And this is a radical for many, many years, very active, and yeah. So this to me is the question.
Yeah, no, it's kind of interesting. And again, I'm just trying to think in my mind how to tie this into the readings. But does the avant-garde even really exist anymore? I mean, or was Warhol the end?
No, Josh is shaking his head. He's the monitor here, the bellwether for that. Right.
The avant-garde.
Shaking his head. Right.
Who is
Josh? Josh. Yeah.
Yes. So share. Yes. But...
Right. I mean, Josh can speak to this and probably the arts and stuff. Yeah.
I didn't realize you wanted me to say something about this. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I feel like the avant-garde was a very specific thing ultimately, that was related to kind of publishing, a change in the kind of publishing. But just in general, like, no, I don't think so at all. I think that contemporary art, for example, has been wholly commodified. I guess I would see more interesting things happening just kind of generally on the internet in terms of people producing their own content and in ways apart from the way we typically think about art. But I think that even then you're sort of trapped within the system again. So I think it's difficult to say that there is some kind of subversiveness that could be powerful enough to change change movement, I guess. Yeah.
Without spending too much time on it, could you say something about avant-garde and publishing, that connection?
I mean, I think the way Berger sort of sets up the theory of the avant-garde, for example, was about kind of this change, this moment where the paperback. I guess he sort of tells the story of when books became sort of more available, it changed the content of the kind of writing, for example, and that and, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say what interests me about that is, I'll go back to Godard again in his, very, very recently, he's talked about that. If he could go back, what he would do differently would be to focus more on distribution as well as production.
Yeah.
And so, when you bring up Victor, it's Berger or Bergin?
No, it's Peter Berger.
Peter Berger,
German
Right.
theorist who wrote a book called The Theory of the Avant-Garde.
Right,
And
I read it.
Yeah, he took on Bertolt Brecht,
Yeah.
as well as Antoine Artaud, et cetera. And in some ways, given the fact that both Adorno and then, of course, Benjamin had an aesthetic, in a sense, the work of art in the age of technical reproduction. And then, of course, the Arcades project, which is, again, the commodity and the fetish that's being studied. And then, of course, Marcuse is the aesthetic dimension, which was a sketch of what aesthetics should be. So, and when Richard says techne is to give birth, and the maieutic, the midwifing of that birth that we find in Socrates and in all the Platonic dialogues, the question really to me, if you're going to really think about the left and what does it really have going for it, if you will, is the poetry of the future. The question is, how do you shape that? I'm not just saying it's new, it's out of the blue, and we get rid of all the old categories, but we have to overturn the categories. That's what radical imagination, or that's what the imagination's supposed to do, is to overturn the old categories when they're no longer value, or at least put them up to critique. So I think this is very important. And I think when, Josh mentions commodification too, that's a real issue. What is non-commodifiable, or what do we really mean about the commodity today? Do we have to not talk about it as an evil in a way? The evil commodification is the stupid advertising you see at the NFL, the AFC championship game, and you're going to see worse with the Super Bowl. You know what's going to go on in 2 weeks now. You're going to have this competition. You're going to be reading in the papers, ad infinitum about, the best ads on Super Bowl, right? These are the games the bourgeoisie play. This is the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie in a different way. This is what they do. This is gamesmanship. Yeah.
But I also think, the idea of breaking down the poetry of the future is these categories between, say, fiction and documentary, or between what is, look at how you find in Godard's films, Fanon quoted, poetry quoted. And it has a sense. It's not unlike something Pound was doing, but it forces you to think, which is something like this. The narrative structure that is in, say, episodic TV is so enforced, so radically enforced, and it's so limiting in terms of there's no, you don't cross between thought, and this is what for example Godard did, but to cross between, to elicit thinking, to elicit the reading of Marx, to get back to Karl's thing, to cite Marx in some way, to cite other texts, something which is, even when we go back to Greek tragedy and think of it in the context of that society, it's a very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's playing off, it's referring to a lot of other texts in a way. And there's a way in which the dominant media right now closes down these kinds of connections, which, again, Citizen Kane, which started with these newsreels. This is something I've been interested in Adieu Lacan, which is, of course, psychoanalysis, but it's also a drama, or a Conophile Z, which is a lot of this, critical theory, and a story, but so kind of, and you can't do this in major net, you can't do this through the major distribution portals. They just won't allow it in. They have certain ways of, for example, a film to go on Netflix has to be 4K. Now, why the blank do you have to do? It controls it in terms of a certain amount of, it makes it more expensive. And then also in terms of the kind of storytelling, all of this kind of controls, and then you listen to people who are watching this episodic TV over and over and think it's the same thing as a film. A TV series is controlled by capital in a totally different way, right? The director is the low person on the totem pole, does not control anything. It's a much more, there are advantages. It's not all negative. I'm not saying there are advantages to it in some ways. It's a more, in some ways, collective. It's less about auteur, quote, but nevertheless, if we want to talk about the poetics of the future in terms of the visual media, it's very interesting to look at video art. Video art is very interesting. It used to be, what was done in video art in the 70s, for example. So there is, interesting work being done, but it's completely, it's marginalized. In the ways it's more marginalized now, a lot of it gets pushed out by TikTok, or it gets pushed out by, this kind of I don't know, entertainment.
So maybe the first fight is in the attention economy, right? Who has captured the attention economy? That seems to me to be, it's not only just of a question of audience, but it's a question of, or the reception of the audience. It's really the question of the attention economy. Are we going through a period where the attention itself, the ability to think dialectically like Marx, to be able to, construct such a thing, or to be able to think through this kind of protensional, retensional, Husserlian, theories of intentionality, and also tertiary retention, the role of the archive in the revolution in the senses. This is one thing I like about when you start to think about Kittler. He's looking at a revolution in the senses, how we think about the senses, how our sensory perception is then shaped by these objects. And he's doing, and this guy is very interesting. I mean, I remember looking at this, and when I was in the back on the phone, I saw old Siegfried on the shelf. The subtitle of the book is Towards an Archaeology of Hearing and Seeing by Technical Means. I mean, this is good stuff. I mean, in a sense, because Marx, in the early Marx, talks about the theoretician of the senses, right? In a way. And we, how jaded have we become? How much, when Godard says, he quotes, the things are here, why invent them? In a sense, yes, it's in front of it. As Heidegger would say, the orientation is there. Let's go back to the pre-Socratic. So I think these things are really worth thinking about, right, in a sense. And again, one thing, look, listen, again, I'm not Heideggerian politically at all, but I do respect the fact that this thinker, right, had the ability to think about the closure of Western metaphysics, right, ending from Plato to Nietzsche, and that Hegel is the culmination of representational thinking, and et cetera, and then talk about the end of philosophy as a limit, not the end of capital, but the end of philosophy as a limit, and the task of thinking that we are bequeathed, if you will. I mean, the gift, the donation, the given is really the task of thinking. So this to me seems to be what we should do. That these categories, what does it mean to be a wage earner today? Yeah, what does that really mean, Carl? I mean, I love the category. I love it. What does it really mean? That you're subjected to the weekly paycheck? You go to what is the everyday life of the wage laborer, et cetera? Yeah, so, I mean, these would be good goals, all of this. How do we take those older categories that really meant something to Marx, right? And obviously the condition of the working class in Manchester in England, right? How do we take those categories and make them much fresher so that we can reach, right, in a sense, right? Yeah. So
it's interesting as people have been, it just makes me think of Stiegler and when you were talking, the poetics of the future and the radical imagination.
That's Marx. He talks about the poetry, Yeah, that
Yeah,
Marx said
and-
this, not Stiegler.
Yeah.
I'm reading.
No, I know
I'm gonna bring out my little doll. I have the philosopher's doll of Karl Marx. I can, do a ventriloquist. Yeah, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But it made me think of Deleuze and Guattari, which whatever you want to say about the success or lack thereof of what they do overall. I mean, I think one thing that they're very, very strong about is that politics ultimately has to operate at the level of pleasure and desire. And I was just thinking about how this, you could bring this sort of conceptually into dialogue with what I think Stiegler is doing, which is this. He seems very concerned about this process or the breakdown of individual and social individuation. And, he's searching for a new form of sublimation. And as I understand it, in kind of the Freudian and maybe Lacanian, correct me if I'm wrong, but that, sublimation is not just suffering, it actually involves pleasure, right? That the idea that, a successful sublimation, you experience pleasure in what, is constituted as the object of, into which you've sublimated. And so, anyway, I was just, thinking about, and then the attention economy, that's very much where he comes in with the idea of retention, and this notion that successful protension and individuation involves the ability, but it's not clear to me ultimately what it involves in terms of the retentional component of sort of this model that he's putting out there. I mean, it's clearly memory, it's clearly the way we inscribe things.
Well, he's distinguishing between types of memory too.
Right.
Exactly. And Richard was pointing earlier with the use of techne and maieutic as the role of anonymous nemesis in our world. How do one recollect, right? In a sense that's very different than just memory, memorization. The great Platonic dialogue on this, by the way, is the Meno. Yeah. Great dialogue.
There was in the essay on 1968, I think he talks at that point about, what he means by techne and technics. And it's something like, kind of a common cultural repository that is available for use and is continually being appropriated and reinvented and transformed. And it seems like what he's concerned with is the fact that this is now being captured by certain, motives, commercial motives, capitalist motives, market motives, proprietary motives that impair the possibility of new forms of individuation. I mean, that's kind of how I read what he was doing.
I think, again, in terms of retention, I mean, what's interesting about, this small group and what I've just been doing with starting to distribute or pre-distributing to these mainly to associations, what we call groups, which have so far been mostly Lacanian psychoanalytic associations in Moscow, in Kiev, in Bulgaria, in Greece, in London, in Toronto, in British Columbia, all over the place, in Argentina, so many in Argentina, is there small groups. They think they kind of keep together, not unlike this group. They're in other words, the thinking is done individually, but it's also done collectively in a certain sense. The idea of a zoon politikon, a human being in relation to some kind of group psychology and analysis ego. I forget where it is in the Grundrisse, but and somebody talked about subjectivity, and how this kind of form of whatever we call it depends upon a kind of reductive notion of identity and such. But these, for me, trying to make a buck with this film, which in part is about finding an audience for it, it's very interesting the way it's not just individuals that you're tapping into these groups that, think together over long periods of time, and have their autonomous quality, and yet kind of share certain sources, literary or intellectual references and such. So I think and the thing is, and then minor literature, it's very interesting, the idea of a minor, and this is Deleuze and Guattari, and the pleasure and desire, the way that the dominant notions of pleasure and desire in terms of the image is very prescribed. And these smaller groups, or these whether it's turning to Kafka or it's turning to, which I think Deleuze and Guattari have as a model of minor literature, contemporary work, art that's being done in these kind of minor ways, and it's very interesting because of breaking these barriers between what is, to show the pleasure and desire in Marx, in reading Marx, for example, which I have to say for volume 1 of Capital, I find incredibly, can't say much for the rest of the volumes, but volume 1 is a great read.
Yes.
It's a great read in black humor too, which is great. He's got the black humor working. And one thing I wrote many moons ago, I don't even know where it is, but I wrote about how the footnotes should be read in relation to Capital.
Oh my God.
There's a running commentary of black humor.
Yeah.
Plato's dialogues were nothing but a projection of the Egyptian caste system. You can do wonders with that. You go back to the beginning of the Timaeus, right?
Oh.
You Greeks are mere children, right? You have so many great footnotes about, all the. Remember that John Stuart Mill was an agent of, quote unquote, the British East Indies Company, and it's, so he has all these great moments. I mean, you're talking about a narratological structure on top of a critical analytical structure that is unbelievable, a touchstone.
And so
you can tell my pleasure in reading it.
And just there's a way in which, for me, like even with these texts now, have I read them as an individual? Yes, of course. But it's also like, coming here on Mondays and, what each person then brings back that I've, that I kind of dimly, and then it's, so that relation of a group, to an individual and that kind of, is very interesting, I think. And the dominant is obsessed with the dominant. I mean, that football game, I mean, it's obsessed with the dominant. It doesn't want you to think outside of that in a way. Yes.
See you this week, Beryl. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So anyway.
Richard, no, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I really am I'm getting on thinner and thinner ice, and
one thing that this is a question to Richard, but also other people who are more deeply involved in media and aesthetics. But how could film, or does film? Let me back up. It seems like the level at which pleasure or potentially subversive pleasure could occur is really, at the level of everyday life. Just, right? It's sort of at that level that I think both hegemony is constructed, and also, that's where pleasure resides. And I'm wondering, like, it seems like we need to somehow return to that, like the level of, the quotidian almost, in some sense. And I'm wondering, does film...
I think you have a great point, Carl. I think what both Kittler and Stiegler give us is different things. For Kittler, this kind of reworking, you have to think about pleasure in relation to the senses and feeling and sensibility. They're giving us different models, if you will, of the feeling and sensibility, different attempts to look at sense perception and how it's being reworked. And this is why I keep saying the poetry of the future has to take into account a lot of these things. Someone just pushing around a gun, right, on a video game, or trying to destroy something, setting traps to blow up the enemy, may be taking great pleasure in that, and someone else doesn't. So this is very important for us to think through,
Right.
Yes,
And how would, I'm wondering,
back, of course, yeah.
how would film, I mean, I just don't have like the depth of knowledge about film, but just like could film allow us to sort of enter into everyday life in sort of like, I'm thinking of like Lefebvre, the rhythm analysis, or just sort of, the experiential qualities of the everyday, and to begin to.
Stiegler is dealing with that with cinematic consciousness, right? Yeah. Isn't he proposing that?
Right, but I'm almost wondering, like,
and time, temporality is a way around the malaise, or it kind of opens up these questions of malaise, the cinematic consciousness. Yeah. Let me. I want to go to something here because I think it'll help frame it differently.
I mean,
Stiegler in a later work, in Symbolic Misery, the first chapter is called Aesthetics and Politics. The epigraph is the famous thing from Deleuze. It is not a case of worrying or hoping for the best, but of finding new weapons. That's Deleuze, right? We need to find new weapons, All right. So the first section is called Aesthetics and Politics, and maybe I can get Matt or myself to scan it and send it to everybody. It's about 4 pages, but I'm going to just read. The question of politics, which is what we're discussing here, is a question of aesthetics, and vice versa. The question of aesthetics is a question of politics. I use the word aesthetics here in its widest sense, where aesthesis means sensory perception, and where the question of aesthetics is, therefore, that of feeling and sensibility in general. So the political question is about feeling and sensibility in general, right? I maintain that we need to return to the question of aesthetics, particularly regarding its connection with the question of politics, in an appeal to the art world to recover a political understanding of its role. Again, back to the avant-garde here, if you will. The abandonment of the question of politics by the art world is a catastrophe.
Michael, who are you reading?
Stiegler. I'm quoting from Bernard Stiegler, from a book called Symbolic Misery. Right? Right? And the chapter is called Aesthetics and Politics.
Yeah.
And likewise, the political world's abandonment of the question of aesthetics to the culture industry, which Richard has talked about, control of networks, control of cinema, et cetera, and the market in general is also catastrophic. So we have this double catastrophe working at once, right? The abandonment of politics by the art world, right? At the same time, the market economy, the question of aesthetics that's been given to the culture industry and the financial sector, Obviously, I do not mean that artists should become politically engaged, right? This is good. I mean that their work is originally engaged in the question of the sensibility of the other, hence art as subversion, right? And art as possibly undermining, dominant ways of seeing and
categories. Yes, this sounds like Rancière a lot, but
yeah, sure. The question of politics is especially that of the relation to the other and a feeling together, or what is called sympathy, feeling together, right? Yep. The problem of politics is one of knowing how to be together, to live together, to stand each other and stand together, right? Across and starting from our singularities, much more profound than our differences. A new concept. Remember, difference was always the day, right? Won the day. Multiculturalism, difference, diversity, all this. He's talking about singularities. and beyond our conflicts of interest. Politics is the art of securing the unity of the state in its desire for a common future, in its individuation, its singularity as becoming one, right? That's what politics is for him. Such a desire assumes a common aesthetic ground. Being together is feeling together. A political community is therefore a community of feeling. The question of political aesthetics. If we are unable to love things together, landscapes, towns, objects, works, languages, etc., then we cannot love ourselves. This is interesting to me. Yeah. This is the meaning of philia in Aristotle. Loving ourselves is loving together things other than ourselves. The notion of philia, which means also love, friendship, right? And there are many, many connotations, as Richard can point out again. The question of culture, as it is formulated in its essence by art, is now more than ever at the heart of the economy, of industry, and of politics. The sensible community is today entirely fabricated by the technologies of what Deleuze calls the control society. And it is essentially on this front that the international economic struggle is taking place. It's very interesting. The globalization of spectatorship, the globalization of the Super Bowl that will, et cetera, right? Many, many things. The consistent thing. And as Richard said, and he anticipated Stiegler here, or Stiegler anticipated that Richard would say this, Jacques Rancière has rightly noted, right, that politicity is sensible, that the question of politics is immediately aesthetic. But he has strangely overlooked that the sensibility of the industrial area, bombarded as it is by marketing, has become the stake in a veritable war in which the weapons are technology, right? And maybe optical media in Kittler's sense, and where the victims are individual and collective cultural singularities. And that this has resulted in the development of a massive symbolic misery. It's very interesting, in a way. I'm sorry I didn't assign this. We can read it. I mean, just section 1. This is volume 1 of the hyper-industrial epoch, of his other works. Not so much ontologically, but grounded in the present tense, right? In today's control society, also modulation societies, aesthetic weapons play an essential role, which is what Rifkin is referred, I don't like Rifkin, but cultural capitalism. Stanley used to get on me. How come Stiegler reads Rifkin and not me? Right, he used to say this. Why didn't he read the Jobless Future? I said, well, we're going to write him a letter. Yeah, unfortunately, he's not there to have the letter reach its destination, but maybe it will to his people. Okay, it has become a matter of controlling the technologies. This is interesting. A new phrase, the technologies of aesthesis, the audio-visual or the digital, for example. And in this way, controlling the conscious and unconscious rhythms of bodies and souls, modulating through the control of these flows, these rhythms of consciousness and life. It is in the same concept that the concept of lifetime value, life, space, time, space, value, has recently been invented by marketing as the economically calculable value of an individual lifetime, which amounts to the desingularization and disindividuation of its intrinsic value. So breaking with this tradition, Manet introduced a feeling which was not shared by everyone. And from the 19th century onwards, aesthetic conflicts multiplied. But these conflicts, taking place against the backdrop of the massive industrial transformation of society, engendered a process of sympathy construction, which is characteristic of human aesthetics. A creativity transforms the world in view of building a new communal sensibility, forming the inquiring us of an aesthetic community to come. We might call this an aesthetic experience as realized by art. In the same way we speak of scientific investigation as experience, it aims at the discovery of an other feeling, its future bearing. I believe that aesthetic, however, that aesthetic ambition in this sense has largely collapsed. And this is because a huge proportion of the population is totally subjected to the aesthetic conditioning of marketing, now hegemonic for the vast majority of the world, and is therefore estranged from any experience of aesthetic investigation. We don't have experience. This is Heidegger's very, very prophetic in certain ways. This Erlebnis, Erfahrung, and the deep experiences we don't have. This is what we lack. Adorno, negative dialectics is to get back to the experience of the subject after through all the negative dialectics has been exhausted. So moreover, the other part of the population, that part that continues to experiment, has turned their back. And this is interesting. The artists themselves, he goes back to this, has turned his back on those who found her in this condition. It was on the day, April 2002. On that day, I saw something terrifying clarity. We could say the same thing of Trump, right? That the people who voted for Jean-Marie Le Bon are people with whom I feel nothing, right? As though between us, there's no common aesthetic experience. I realize that these men and women, these young people, have no feeling for what's happening. And for this reason, they no longer feel part of society. So you have this new group of alienated subjectivities, disindividuated, disaffected youth, right? You can think about this, about the January 6th so-called insurrection, if you will. Yeah. Anyway, they inhabit a zone, right, of whatever form of organization, commercial, industrial, rural, which is no longer a world because aesthetically it is disengaged. 21st April was a political aesthetic catastrophe. These people are in a situation of severe, he calls it symbolic misery. I really like this term. I think this is part of the whole point of this select psychic collective individuation, the borderline. How do we treat, right? What is the pharmacon about vis-a-vis symbolic misery, right?
So, Michael, could I just what work is this from?
This is from a book. It's volume 1 of his multi-volume. This is called the Hyper-Industrial Epoch. This is volume 1, of which he engages the pathology of the moment, the symbolic misery. Yeah.
So I guess, like hearing that, for me, I mean, maybe this is sort of not a very well articulated question, but you think about the amount of people spend online, and on their phones. I mean, just the amount of
Right.
So is it possible, does that close off a kind of pleasure and a kind of, an experience of sort of, eroticism? I don't mean just like in a narrow sexual sense, I want to, have sex with somebody, but sort of that, eros.
Let's think about the motions on the phone.
Is it effectively closed off?
What is the masturbatory movement of the phone? I mean, in a certain way on the cell phone.
Let me
Yeah, I'm listening. Yeah,
the stream of thought, it kind of is, what I was thinking, earlier, asking Richard and other people about is there a way that, film today can sort of return us to the level of everyday life, sort of, reinvigorate the senses, reinvigorate something about how we experience kind of immediacy that's not quite so
okay. Yeah, we were missing you.
I mean, for me,
we're missing some of your sentences. Yeah,
you said earlier, Michael, that literally. Oh yeah, I have a bad connection. I was just like, how do we kind of get? I mean, it seems like what we're sort of emerging with is sort of this idea of pleasure, desire, sort of the transformational possibilities of art, of cinema, and how can it sort of create new forms of desire?
Look, again, the symbolic misery is an overarching concept here. He again takes on the question of class here too. He has a thing. It is important to realize that contemporary art, contemporary music, show business, freelancers of contemporary show business, along with contemporary literature, philosophy, contemporary science, are a cause of suffering for the ghetto formed by these zones. these new zones, these modulating zones. This misery is not limited to the poor, right? With all due respect to Leonard Cohen, the rich have their channels in the bedroom of the poor, right? Everybody knows, right? These zones are everywhere. They spread like leprosy, right? Anyway, in particular, via television networks, giving concrete existence to Nietzsche's words, the desert grows, right? For all that, not everyone is exposed in the same way to that illness, while huge swaths of the population live in urban spaces stripped of all urbanity, going back to Lefebvre, who wrote a great book on the right to the city, right, in a sense, and was a very urbane character, even though he came from rural France. A tiny minority enjoyed an existence worthy of the name of existing.
But see, but
Yeah.
Michael, let me just interject
Sure.
that he's diagnosing the illness, but like you raised earlier, like what does it mean to, what does the left have to offer other than the diagnosis of the illness? And it seems like that's where, like, what capitalism offers people is the Super Bowl, which is a certain form of, eros, I guess. It's sort of like a feeling together of a
I
time.
could move like Javar Chase. Anyway,
you know
I wish I had that kind of ability. No, I'm just
right, but no,
anyway.
I mean it's kind of like, I mean, that is one of the things about why I think sports have a certain power in the
Well,
societies.
by the way, I reread The Sport of Origin of the State by Gasset or Ortega y Gasset. Very interesting to go back there. Before the family was the tribe and the club, and this was all done in sport. He's very interesting on this matter. It's a very short section of a book called History as a System. Yeah. But anyway, yeah.
But yeah, I'm just kind of riffing, but like all this idea of our senses and our sensibilities and sympathy and
Yeah, but I'm just
all these-
talking about this in terms of it seems like there are many things on the table. Yes, what would the new avant-garde, if we don't have to use that term, but what is political aesthetics, right?
Mhm.
Ultimately, is that the key to unlocking, some of the things that have us in this malaise of strategies of looking at economic determinism? Everybody's going to say Rick Wolf is going to sing the same song, he's a good friend and all of that, but it's going to be the same old thing about what capitalism is doing to everybody, right? Etc. Right? We need to go beyond that. I mean, this is where a Stiegler and a Kittler are much more interesting in the sense that they're broadening the horizon to really bring into question sensibility and understanding, to use Kantian language again, or sensibility, and movement. What is sense perception? What is happening here in terms?
Two
Yeah,
things
Richard, yeah, please, yeah.
come
Sorry.
to mind. One is Colin, I'm going to get his name wrong. Colin Kaepernick, who kneeled down,
Yeah, Kaepernick, yeah.
who took a knee
Yeah.
and kind of, again, broke a category. I mean, people were, he broke a cardinal rule. He introduced politics, right? He politicized that space, he crossed zones. I mean, what he was accused of, look, you're entitled to your politics, just not there. And that's exactly.
Just like Laura Ingraham said about LeBron James, shut up and dribble.
Yeah, right.
He started texting on Black Lives Matter. Shut up and dribble. Can you imagine telling LeBron James, King James, this? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm just playing on that. It's interesting how black codes work nicely. Let's take a King of England, and call a basketball player, who will probably be the second billionaire athlete. Anyway, shut up and dribble. Told by some white woman from Dartmouth, on Fox News. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
And then the other thing that, is again from Dan Georgiakis' book about the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, how they decided at some point, they realized that they needed to educate people, that they needed to do these outreach into the suburbs. At least there was some argument about this, but that they could they could do revolutionary actions until the cows came home, and they were just keep getting re-manipulated in the media unless people could read things differently, unless people had other context in which to understand the actions. It wasn't just about the actions. It was about the way they were being interpreted, and creating these. So one of the things I think you can do, about the misery is that there's no, is to kind of, is to solicit or elicit a ways of thinking that allow people to interpret a different interpretive community, which is what is partly deadened by these silos of entertainment, silos of education.
And also in the educational institutions themselves, who are really the first attacks on this moment of forming interpretive communities. Splitting up disciplines, right? The old 2 cultures, 3 cultures now, 4 cultures, business administration, one part of the campus, economics, another part of the campus, right? Computer science, one part, mathematics, another part of the campus, right? The humanities, completely separated from any kind of transdisciplinary, or in the older language, interdisciplinary thinking, right? Or activity. So this has been going on a long time. Yeah. That's where you hit. It's no accident that the war on education and public education happens during the, this is going back to economics, during the municipal crisis in New York City. You want the origin of financialization and forced financialization. You have it in the figure of Felix Rohatyn, right? Mm-hmm. And Lazard Fair coming to the rescue, creating the Municipal Assistance Corporation. Yeah, I mean, James O'Connor wrote a brilliant book about the fiscal crisis of New York City and what happened, right?
This is in the 70s, right? This is at the end of the 70s,
yes.
Right? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. You want to know what's wrong, Senator Palantine? Remember Taxi Driver? This is one big sore. Sore. Yeah, he says about, and he tells Senator Pat, you remember this Taxi Driver when the senator is running? Yeah, this is one big sore, a hard rain ought to come, wash it all away. Travis Bickle, based on the model of Arthur Bremer's notebooks, who was the attempted assassin of George Wallace, right? So, yeah, I mean, we have some very interesting, moments here, going, but again, yeah. I just want to point out that I think maybe we should do, this is a very accessible book, by the way. I find this, the more I read of Stiegler, I find this one of his better summations of where he is. And I'm sorry I didn't assign it. I thought, we just can't do everything, but, we could always, maybe look at this if you want.
Yeah,
I want to read one more section just of this, the first chapter here, Aesthetics and Politics. And yes, Carl, he does offer alternatives later, right? He has a whole section on eros and stasis, a whole thing on Tiresias, etc., and the moment. He's very good at the use of the ancients, I think. It is possible to distinguish, right, at least 2 types of aesthetics. There's that of the psychophysiologist, this is good, right, who study the sense organs. Yeah, so you could actually think of psychophysiologists as Nietzsche, right, in some ways, the privileging of the body and the sense organs, in a way. And that of the history of art, of artifacts, symbols, and works. While the psychophysiological aesthetic appears stable, that of the artifact evolves continually through time. But the stability of the sense organs is an illusion, and this is very much like Kittler too, is an illusion in so much as they are subjected to a never-ending process of defunctionalization and refunctionalization, which is tied precisely to the evolution of artifacts. This is very common to what Kittler's doing in terms of optical media. The aesthetic history of humanity amounts to a series of successive adjustments between the 3 great organizational structures that constitute man's aesthetic power: the body with its physiological organization, artificial organs, technologies, objects, tools, instruments, and artworks, and social organization resulting from the articulation of artifacts and bodies. It is necessary to conceive, and this is another thing that he's doing. He's very good at this. General organology, which would study the joint history of these three dimensions of human aesthetics, along with the resulting tensions, the inventions, and the potentials. This would be the initial consideration of a project that I am trying to outline here. So this is very much his Kittlerian attempt. You could call this, the diagnosis, of course, is symbolic misery, that is not so class specific. It's not really that class specific in some ways. He's talking about this as a generalized malaise, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And he says only this kind of genealogical approach allows us to understand the aesthetic evolution leading to today's symbolic misery, where we affirm and hope that a new force is. So here comes the pharmacon now. Within, right, all the poison, there may be some remedy, lies concealed as much in the extraordinary opening of possibility brought by science and technology as in the affect of suffering itself. So I think this is very important. And then he goes into a long digression on Bernays, right, and propaganda techniques, right, in many ways. And and he wants to talk also about, let me just say one other thing which is interesting here. He's talking about global misery in the next section in the symbolic, but he talks about the audio-visual techniques of marketing lead, moreover, to a situation where through the images I see and the sounds that I hear, my past tends to become the same as my neighbors. And the diversification of channels is simply the particularization of targets, which explains they all tend to do the same thing. Being increasingly constituted by the images and sounds that the media streams through my consciousness, as well as by the objects and relationships with these objects, that these images lead me to consume. My past is less and less differentiated from that of other people. It loses, then the past loses its singularity, which is as much to say, I lose myself as the singularity. And he really considers this term very, very important, the singularization of psychic individuation. Right?
Can I ask, that doesn't seem right to me, that somehow,
Okay.
in the sense, again, I'd have to read the whole thing, but it seems that one of the things is that everything has become so fractured that, it's almost like so catered to the individual. There's a standardization, he has that great term that, the proletarianization of the consumer, right? Which is really the deeper underlying logic. But it seems like what we lack today is any sense of a common history, any sense of a shared reference point that provides the basis of, what we used to think of as a public sphere. For all the limits of the public sphere in liberal bourgeois democracy.
Yeah. I think he's speaking to the total lack of the ability not to recollect memories, that this becomes a politics of memory, and it's much easier to say that this lack of differentiation between shared history is more and more prominent because of that, because of the hyponymity. Right. Because of the superficiality. And what is lost, and this is interesting where he goes with this, because one of the first steps for Stiegler, and again, he wants to broaden what Freud did in terms of primary narcissism. He's going to talk about primordial narcissism after analyzing a case history of a serial killer in France. Once I am deprived of my singularity, this is taken away from me, you're just like us. You know how this works in group think and groups, etc. etc. I can no longer love myself. It is only possible to love oneself starting from the intimate knowledge of one's own singularity. This is interesting. Where does this love of oneself, come from? Auto-affection in Kantian language, right, if you will. And this is why the community originally consists in the intimacy of the bond between self and self. Art is the experience and the support of this sensible singularity as an invitation to symbolic activity, to the production and discovery of traces in collective time. You can hear the Derridian moment here, also the supplement working out. And this is why the question of aesthetics, the questions of politics, and the question of industry together form one question.
Earlier, you read something that he said that I cannot. It's only in loving something collectively, sort of together, the experience of kind of sympathy, a shared love of something, that is the precondition of loving myself. Didn't you read something essentially to that?
Well, he said in the intimacy of the bond between self and self, that's where the community is.
Right. No,
Where
but
the
earlier,
bond singularities and singularities, or self and self. Yeah.
but earlier you were reading something where he was talking about aesthetics and sympathy, and he was talking about the sort of the shared love of something, that there's a common experience that is the basis of loving oneself.
Well, I think he's saying in some ways that there's no, or it's an apparent paradox, but that without that individuality or without that singularity, there is no meaningful collective. There's a mass. There are these common. As your past is turned into mush. A meat that you don't have to chew, food you don't have to chew, by this commercial media, you in fact lose singularity, which also means you lose the ability to join in a meaningful way. The collective. I'm reminded of that note that the Athenian Constitution. There is no such thing as the Athenian Constitution. In the Greek, it's the Constitution of the Athenians. In other words, it was an ongoing, experiment, not something that existed apart. And that kind of group experience is only possible, when people have the singularity of their own past and can connect to it. I mean, that seems to me.
If Richard and I would have a discussion about Godard and how we came to understand Godard, we would be sharing self-to-self singularities, right? In a sense, in terms of, we would not be just being, a shared quote experience. We would be sharing singularities, how we came to Godard, how do we interpret it? Where do we see the history? Where do we see the effects today?
Which film was, how did we get to? Where you were.
You and I, Carl, would talk about creative destruction in Schumpeter. Is that what's really going on right now? Is that what the technology is doing in terms of political economy? We may come into it in different ways, but we're again in a position of shared, in singularities, right? We're self to self. He's bemoaning this fact that it no longer happens, right? Yeah. This is what he's saying, that what you have is an aesthetic alienation, a new category of alienation, not only alienation in the workplace, but aesthetic alienation, which he thinks might be the starting point to begin to build this quote poetry. Again, my term taken from Marx, the poetry of the future, right? What is the, yeah. And to give up the past in this sense. Marx talks about, not just throwing out the baby in the bathwater, but he talks about, the poetry of the new, right? In a sense, the new categories, etc. So this is important to keep in mind. How does this psychic individuation of Richard Leeds and Michael Pelias take place differently, but they can have a self-to-self conversation about, thing. One is a filmmaker, another one is a philosopher, if you will, but outside of those parameters too, right? So I think this is where he's really trying to go here, right? This is the anonymous at work, right? Anonymousness at work, anonymousness at work versus that of the hyponymita, which he sees everywhere, this externalization of memory that leads to, again, aesthetic alienation. If I pick up the phone to Google something right now, I'm aesthetically alienated, according to Stiegler. It might help in terms of knowledge and maybe have use in terms of its acceleration, its our ability. We all do it, but in a way, it's not this, love, right, of oneself that's going on there. It's not this, this moment. It's much more deeper. He's looking at the more deeper things, right? In terms of this thing, this primordial narcissism. How do we really love ourselves, right? How do we really love ourselves? What is this auto affection? And he's looking at this as a major lack that he's positioning against symbolic misery, right? There's a counterpointing that's going on here throughout. Symbolic misery may be the diagnosis, right? In a way, but this notion of auto affection is one step out, right, of this, right? And that the aesthetic, in a way, the aesthetic dimension, and particularly the political aesthetic dimension, right, is able to give. It's not just art for art's sake, right, in a way, even though he understands this. And he's going to talk about, again, this whole notion of the sense organs versus that you go to the art history class, and I'm sure we all have this experience, where the teacher puts up slides. Here's the Renaissance. Look at this painting, look at the Rembrandt, what he does, and and this effect in the, in his self-portrait, right, etc. He's talking again about something different, right? He wants to go on, right? The two types, right? Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and this is connected to industry, which you mentioned about the proletariatization is not only the proletariatization of the worker, right, in a sense, just becoming a consumer. The proletization of the world means you no longer know how to make, right? This is what's been lost, the knowledge to make things, right? I've been corrected on this. I have a good friend who studies France very actively. He's Swiss French and a very good philosopher. But he tells me about these kids. I think I mentioned this. These 13-year-olds that are actually woodworkers, right? That they've created a company already, exquisite work with wood. They want that. This is their vocation, right? We were talking about the necessity for apprenticeship and vocations again. Maybe
The
we
idea of métier.
Yeah, the métier, right, exactly.
Métier.
It comes from the Greek métis, right? Yeah, cunning, right, as well as making, right, together. Yeah. So anyway, this is very important to kind of keep in mind. How is he, pulling this together? We don't have to agree fully. I mean, but let's again. I think we should try to understand, because for me, he really speaks to our times, to my, viscerally. Stiegler really speaks to me viscerally in a way of where we really are with all this stuff now, right? In many ways, right? Yeah. I mean, you can notice out there's nothing but depression. I can see it everywhere, right? Yeah. Nothing but. Second biggest disease in the United States after obesity, right? And yeah.
And those two are probably linked in some way.
Of course, but at the same time, emaciation and is also part of that too, right? I mean, you go back,
Falstaff.
Yeah, Falstaff, right?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe they're the happy ones. We're waiting for the fat lady to sing, right? But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I just, it's interesting just, thinking about what you're saying and what other people, and, just sort of where I went in my mind was just thinking about, again, this idea of, can art, film, music, aesthetics sort of have this kind of transformative ability to open up new realms of pleasure and desire. It seems like that's kind of what we're thinking about. And then I was thinking about, Kittler. It's very interesting what he's doing, but it's like the technology is operating on us in some way. I mean, we invent the technologies, right? Humans invent the technologies, but it operates on us in a way that's absolutely unintended, right? I mean, that's sort of how I read him. That, you know, we use it in certain ways, but it's transforming our senses in ways that transformation can be a form of pleasure. It can't, you know, it seems like there's a lot of pleasure in
Yeah,
what
I know it's getting
talking
late,
about,
but
like,
I mean, what did you think of this whole thing about this reading? I mean, he had the Heidegger very short, right? Section on the age of the worldview in the Kittler lectures on page 75. And then, of course, the Jesuits and their control of optical media, which he takes a long time on. Yeah, it's very interesting. I remember a piece that of Felix Guattari that was circulating with Edward Said that a little short piece he did. We have to position the camera outside of being controlled by the Catholic Church. That's how we have to read, a certain period, right? He's very good at this. And then the Jesuit optic thing in the section on technologies of the fine arts, right? So this is very interesting. There's also the question, I'm going to go to this. I'm sorry to jump from the Stiegler discussion, but I think this is important vis-a-vis both Stiegler and Kittler. There's also the question of what made the Laterna the magic lantern so attractive for Jesuits of all people. But before I answer this question, I want to make a short diversion into the realms of philosophy. As we know, in his late work, Heidegger attempted to think of the basic concept of European philosophy being as historically changeable despite all tradition. According to one of Heidegger's theses, being first constituted itself in the form of a representation, a Vorstellung, in European modernity. Representational thinking delivered being as an object for a subject, which was not at all true for the Greeks. And I don't know why he puts Romans in there, but yeah, maybe there's something there. A lecture on optical media can verify the facts of the case. It can be said, following Heidegger's line of thought, linear perspective and the camera obscura were precisely the media of this representation. Very interesting, huh? When you really try to think this through, this age of the world picture that we read, right? The Bildung, right, etc. Whose hands is it in? And then he's going to go into the Jesuits, control. In the next step in the history of being, in the philosophy of Descartes, the next epoch, the representation of the subject is represented to the subject once again as such, cogito ergo sum. I am because I can represent anything presented before me. Very interesting. As Descartes makes very clear in the cogito, the difference between day and night, waking and dreaming, reality, this is all in the discourse on the method in the second section, and also in the meditation on first philosophy in the second section of that as well, second meditation. Dreaming, reality, and hallucination does not count. This also allows us to grasp the history of optical media more precisely. The technical device that represents representation itself instead of reality is, of course, the magic lantern. The image of something, in other words, its representation, is slid into the black box and is illuminated by a light that casts a representation on this representation, an image of this image onto the wall. That concludes the history of being and my explanation on why the Laterna Magica could not have come into existence until 100 years after the camera obscura. Very
he has a
interesting
sense
way
of
this guy's thinking. He's smart, man. I'm telling you. Yeah.
He definitely has a sense of humor. I mean, that last sentence was very funny.
It's very interesting the way he takes this up, and for our purposes, to give us a greater understanding of why we should study more of Stiegler's, Technics and his constitution of the objects in the world and the prosthesis, as well as the optical media that Kittler's talking about. And then he goes on to the Jesuits. How did the Catholics control for so long, right? and instead of like Goebbels, who controls the streets, controls the state, maybe who controls the eye controls the state or the power, right? In many ways, in our epoch. And you asked a good question, Carl. What role does cinematic consciousness and cinema itself play in transformative activity, or towards a new political aesthetic? Yeah, in many ways. Lenin loved cinema. He considered it the revolutionary form. He couldn't believe this baby was given to him, right? And he wanted it. This is why he funded, and he was so close to Eisenstein, and funded the whole moment, right? Big time. Yeah. And film departments today, and except for maybe UCLA and NYU, and they're declining because a lot of the good faculty is either left or retired or not been replaced well. But anyway, it's mostly about production today. How can I produce a film? It's not about theorizing. It's not about understanding what cinema is. It's no more longer do you read Andre Bazin and critique from there, right? Yeah. And what is cinema, or the ontology of cinema. People don't read The World Viewed by Cavell. It was a pretty good philosopher in his own right.
Oh yeah, really interesting.
Yeah. So again, what's going on here in terms of these social control, and then to put it again in the Deleuzian language, what kind of weapons do we have to invent? What do we really need? In terms of the choice of new weapons, and to think this through. So, I mean, really, in a way, Kittler's very good at this whole thing about representational thinking. I mean, in a very practical way. I think this is, if you want to think of Kant, this is the critique, the second critique. How do we practically reason? What Hegel said was the French Revolution. In theory, he referred to the critique of practical reason as the French Revolution put into practice, right? So, yeah. Robespierre at work. Anyway, I think it's very, very interesting in this regard. The Jesuits, how Maurice of Nassau and the Prince of Orange did things, who Spinoza liked, right, in many ways. Loyola, I don't know if any of you have read the great treatise by Roland Barthes, Sade, Loyola, Fourier, Loyola. Very good about military, organization in the Sadian, outside in, the chateaus, Loyola's, and Loyola was responsible for La Flèche. This is where René Descartes went to school, right? So you have so many very nice, I mean, I think many narratives here for creativity, as we could go forward here. I don't think we're going to find, quote unquote, the answer or the answer. I think we're going to find maybe some problematization. And then section 2.3, the Enlightenment and image war, and this is also very important too. He reads Bartold Heinrich Broker, the earthly delight in God, right? And then the proven remedy for the eyes, right? In the 18th century. This guy didn't live too long. I mean, 1721 to 1748, right? And he goes on the proven remedy for the eyes, and he cites a poem. This is on page 89, right? In Kittler again. Poets arm their eyes. Is Tony still there, or he left? Yeah, he left. He had to go to dinner, I guess. Okay, so not with an actual small telescope aimed at earthly targets, which is what the word perspective implied during that time, but rather with an internally manual replacement. With an absolutely current invocation of Newton's optics, sight becomes an art that would not exist at all without the artificial aid of devices like the peep show cabinet, right? But the new art of seeing does not merely position itself at the level of much older arts like writing and reading. It also brings to its own innovation to these two sides of literature. After the nymphs and the gods left Greece, poetry was a tedious business. For 2 millennia, it was necessary to rewrite a theme using set rhetorical phrases as if nymphs and gods still existed, right? Hymn to a Grecian, ode to a Grecian urn, Cates, you guys know the story. I'm saying reading according meant copying the arts of old texts and practicing with one's own quill for future texts. These rhetorical conditions, which dominated all schools and universities, with the exceptions of the Jesuits' spiritual exercises, had nothing to do with writing and reading, but rather as a commentary on Aristotle and a late antiquity already noted. They only dealt with tactical references between senders and receivers. This is very interesting, right? Speakers and hearers, writers and readers. Imitating or surpassing an author, that was entirely different from the situation pertaining to writing. Impressing or even overwhelming readers with rhetorical effects and arguments until they no longer recognized truth and falsity, also pure cunning. So he goes on here. This is really worth reading seriously, in my opinion, because you want to know how societies of control work, you get the depth of how sophisticated this really is, right? In terms of what we're dealing with at this point. Then he goes into the Lamberts, Euler, of course, and then the relationship back to Pythagoras and Euclid, and then he goes forward into Lambert and the beginning of phenomenology, right?
Mhm.
Right? And
Yeah, I found that part really interesting. Is that in relation to what you were reading earlier around Descartes, and
Right.
how he's almost trying to invert how we think about these things, that it's these technical media that give rise to these massive transformations of thought and representation. I've actually got to go myself, but
okay, no problem.
I think overall, I guess I had some reaction to Kittler in that it does seem, it's very interesting. It seems also a little reductive, although that might be necessary.
Reductive in what sense? What do you mean reductive?
Well,
Yeah.
just in the sense of one, I think he's definitely engaged in a certain creative appropriation of history to make his point, but that's okay. But I guess just in terms of these major transformations of thought and understanding and sensibility, it seems like he doesn't address social transformations that are concurrent and that cannot, political transformations, economic transformations. So I wouldn't call him a technological reductionist. I wouldn't say he's quite doing that. But if we think about what are the totality of things that give rise to Descartes and or Luther, he's articulating a certain perspective that I've never heard anyone do. So it's very interesting, brilliant, but it seems like it leaves a lot of other things out, which would almost have to go through and seriously,
Okay.
But
any other comments before we close the? I'm sorry, and I'm sorry for my short absence, but I heard a lot of the good comments. I had double hearing going on. I could hear Tony, Richard, Carl, etc. Many of you talking, so it was great. Yeah, and thank you for for that. So
are we going to read Stiegler next week?
No, I thought we would finish a little bit with Kittler, and we could go back to Stiegler's, thing. Would you like to do the symbolic misery, at least the first chapter? Would you like to read that through, or
the first chapter.
Political, yeah.
I have a PDF of it.
Yeah, great.
Oh, great.
Yeah. No, it's a great book. I find this to be a very interesting summation of where he wants to go. This is one of my favorite ones of his, in terms of accessibility. Yeah. The time in Technics is he's writing an ontology. In this case, he's trying to deal with the problems of everyday life in a different way, right? Yeah.
But Patrick, can you send that around to folks?
I will send it to Michael, and Michael can send it out.
I'll send it out. Yeah. Got the list. Yeah.
I'll do that tonight.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So and I think and actually Matt just put it in the drive. I think.
Oh, do you have it?
Maybe he does. He just put it in the chat. Let me just see. Yeah.